The first thing people said when Mara Linfield started hauling timber up the ridge was that she had lost her mind. The second thing they said was that she was wasting good wood. The third thing, and this was the one that followed her into town and sat down at the counter beside her every time she came in for coffee, was that a woman alone on 40 acres with nothing but a cabin the size of a generous closet, it had no business building anything, let alone something that big, that strange, that deliberate. She heard all of it. She kept hauling timber. The valley below her land, a broad, green bowl ringed by the Absaroka Range in northern Wyoming, held a small town called Cutter's Bend. Population 412 in the summer, closer to 380 in winter when the seasonal workers drifted south, and the retired couples who had imagined mountain retirement finally confronted what mountain retirement actually meant. There was a diner, a hardware store, a feed store, a post office that doubled as the town's only pharmacy, and a bar called the Broken Axle that served as the unofficial courthouse for most local disputes and decisions. Mara had moved to Cutter's Bend 3 years before she started building, which in the arithmetic of small mountain towns made her recent enough to still be watched, but old enough that people had stopped being polite about their watching. She had come from Minneapolis after her husband died, not tragically, not suddenly, but in the long, slow way that some people leave, illness unwinding him over 18 months until there was nothing left to unwind. She had sold the house, settled the debts, donated what she couldn't carry, and driven west until the flatness ended and the land rose up and showed her its bones. She had bought the ridge property from an estate sale. The cabin on it was original to the 1940s chinked log construction, one room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that drew well, and a root cellar underneath that smelled like cold earth and pine sap. There was a hand-dug well that produced clear water and a small spring, ved pond at the bottom of the property that froze solid by November. The seller's attorney had told her the access road was seasonal, which turned out to mean impassable for 4 months of the year unless you had a truck with enough clearance and enough stubbornness to match your own. She had both. The first winter she spent learning the land the way you learn a difficult person, by paying attention, by not assuming, by sitting still long enough that it stopped performing for you and started just being itself. She learned where the wind came from and what it sounded like before a storm. She learned that the elk came through the lower pasture in October, and that the coyotes answered each other across the ridge every night at 10. She learned that the cabin, for all its solidity, was cold in a way that went beyond temperature. The logs held the chill deep in their fibers, and no matter how well the fire burned, there was always a zone near the floor and near the windows where the warmth simply did not reach. She learned, most importantly, that the snow was not like the snow she had grown up with. Minneapolis snow was horizontal sometimes, brutal sometimes, but it was urban snow, managed snow, snow that got plowed and salted and argued with by infrastructure. The snow that came off the mountains above Cutter's Bend was something else. It came in volumes that felt geological. It came with wind that didn't so much blow as press, as though the sky were leaning its full weight down onto the valley. It came and came and came, and then paused for a day, and then came again. And when it was finished, the world was not merely covered but transformed, the contours of familiar things gone, replaced by a landscape of pure white geometry that bore no relationship to what had been there before. That first winter she burned through her wood supply in February and spent the last 6 weeks rationing, sleeping in 3 layers and waking to find ice on the inside of the windows and her breath hanging visible in the air above her bed. She was not in danger. She had enough food. The fire never went completely out. But she was miserable in a way that was clarifying. She was cold the way people are cold who have made a mistake and know it, but cannot yet see the full shape of the mistake. She spent that spring thinking. She had grown up on a dairy farm in central Minnesota, the third of 5 children, and her father had been the kind of man who built things to last rather than to impress. He had taught her that the hardest problems were usually solved by the people who were willing to think longer than seemed necessary before picking up a tool. She thought about the cabin and the cold and the wind and the snow and the particular misery of February. She thought about old buildings, old methods, old ways of solving problems that the modern world had decided were obsolete, because the modern world often made that mistake with things that worked. She remembered, from somewhere in her reading, she had brought 4 boxes of books with her to Wyoming, that settlers on the northern plains had sometimes built their barns connected to their houses. In Scandinavia, the practice was ancient. In the hardest climates, the boundary between shelter for animals and shelter for people had always been understood as a boundary of degree rather than kind. Animals generated heat. Hay was insulation. A large structure surrounding a small one changed the thermodynamics of winter in ways that walls and weather stripping alone could not. She did not have animals. She did not plan to have animals, except perhaps chickens eventually, but she thought about the principle. She thought about what it would mean to build something large enough and close enough around the cabin that the cabin would no longer be facing the mountain wind alone. By June, she had a plan. By July, she had started buying materials. She went to the hardware store in Cutter's Bend, a place called Hennessy's, run by a man named Dale Hennessy, whose grandfather had founded it, and whose father had expanded it, and who himself had spent 40 years watching it slowly lose ground to the big box stores in the county seat. And she bought the first load of lumber. Dale had known she was coming. In a town of 400, the news of a woman on the ridge buying timber in quantity had moved through the social body the way any foreign object moves through a living one, quickly and with some resistance. Building something, he said, which was the kind of question small town hardware store owners ask when they already know the answer. A structure over the cabin, she said. Essentially a large barn frame around and above the existing structure. Separate foundation piers, so there's no load transfer to the cabin itself. Airspace between the 2 roof lines. The idea is thermal buffering. Dale looked at her for a moment. How big? 40 by 60, gambrel roof, so the upper space can be used for storage. He looked at her for another moment. He was a careful man, not unkind but economical with warmth, the way men sometimes are who have spent their whole lives watching other people arrive at a place they never left. That's ambitious, he said. Yes, she said. He sold her the lumber. He would continue selling her lumber and hardware and concrete and fasteners for the next 8 months, and he would remain scrupulously neutral on the subject of the project itself, which she respected, but the rest of the town was not similarly restrained. At the Broken Axle, where she came occasionally for dinner because the kitchen was better than its reputation, the conversation found her. A rancher named Chet Burrell, who ran cattle on the land adjacent to hers, and who had initially offered to buy her property when the estate came up for sale, made the first open comment. He was not a cruel man. He was the kind of man who had been right about enough things over the years that he had confused being confident with being correct. "I hear you're building a barn on top of your house," he said. He said it the way you say something when there are other people listening and you want them to know you're saying it. "Around it," she said, "not on top of it. What's the difference? About 40 feet of airspace and a separate foundation system." He looked at the people around him, and the look said, "You see what I'm dealing with, Mara." He said, and he used her name the way people use names when they're about to explain something to you, "That ridge gets wind like you wouldn't believe in winter. You're going to build something 40 feet wide and 60 feet long up there, and expect it to stand. I've engineered it for the load, she said. Who did the engineering? I did. The laugh that came then was not vicious. It was the laugh of people who have decided in advance that something is funny and find their prediction confirmed. There were 4 or 5 of them at the bar, and the laugh moved through them lightly, easily, the way shared jokes do in groups that have known each other long enough to have a shared sense of what is absurd. She finished her dinner and drove home. She was not, as it happened, an amateur. Before Minneapolis, before her husband and the house and the life that had organized itself around those things, she had studied civil engineering for 2 years before switching to architecture, and she had spent a decade working for a firm that specialized in cold climate construction. She knew load calculations. She knew wind uplift. She knew the difference between a structure that looked solid and a structure that was solid. She had done the engineering 3 times, checking herself the way her father had taught her to check herself, and she had had it reviewed by a structural engineer in Billings she'd found through a professional contact, a woman named Sandra Cho, who had looked at the drawings and said the design was conservative and well considered, and she would stake her stamp on it. But Mara did not say any of this at the Broken Axle. She had learned, in the years of her husband's illness and the long aftermath, that there is a kind of energy that gets wasted in explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think. The explanation does not change the decision. It only costs you something. She worked through the summer and into the fall. She poured the foundation piers herself with a rented auger and concrete mixed in batches, working methodically from east to west along the lay out she had marked with stakes and string. She raised the frame in sections, using a gin pole she built herself and a come, a long and a patience that the project required. Twice she came down off the ridge for help, once when she needed a second person to hold a ridge beam while she fastened it, and once when the auger hit rock and she needed someone with a jackhammer to break it out, and both times she paid for the help fairly and thanked the men who gave it and went back to work. The frame went up in August and September, Douglas fir posts and beams, the gambrel trusses she had cut and assembled on the ground and raised as units. She sheathed the walls and roof in October, working faster now because she could see the season turning, the aspens on the lower ridge going gold and the mornings arriving with a cold that had teeth in it. She insulated the walls with dense, back cellulose blown in from the outside, filling every cavity, and she wrapped the exterior with a weather-assistive barrier before putting up the board and batten siding she had milled from local beetle, kill pine. By the 1st of November, when the first real snow came, the outer structure was complete. It stood over and around the cabin the way a cathedral stands over the smaller chapels within it, high, spare, geometric, unadorned. From the road below, and she knew this because she had driven down and looked, it appeared as an ordinary large barn, red, painted now gambrel, roofed, sitting at the top of the ridge with confidence of something that had been there for a long time. You could not see the cabin inside it unless you knew to look for the second roofline visible through the upper windows. The airspace between the 2 structures was approximately 12 feet at its narrowest, and was accessed by a covered walkway she had built connecting the cabin's back door to the barn's interior. In that space she stored firewood, 4 full cords stacked in the south side of the airspace, where it was sheltered but ventilated. She stored tools. She stored the materials for the root cellar expansion she was planning for spring. The space was not heated, but it was protected, and the temperature in it never fell below about 15 degrees even on the coldest nights, which meant the firewood stayed dry and the water line running to the cabin did not freeze. Inside the cabin, the change was immediate and startling. She had worried, briefly, that the outer structure might feel oppressive. that it might take the light or create a sense of enclosure. Instead, it was the opposite. The cabin had always been cold because it was alone on a ridge facing the full weight of the mountain wind. Now it was nested. The outer walls took the wind. The airspace cushioned the temperature swing. The thermal mass of the whole system, the outer walls, the dead air, the cabin walls, was many times greater than the cabin alone had ever had. In October, before the serious cold came, she measured the interior temperature of the cabin at midnight, with the fire burning normally, and found it at 68 degrees. She measured the wind speed outside at 32 miles an hour. She measured the temperature in the airspace at 22. The previous year, on a night with similar wind, the cabin interior at midnight had been 51 degrees with the fire running at full capacity. She wrote the numbers in a notebook and went to bed and slept well. The town continued to talk. By October, the project was finished enough to be visible from the county road, and the visibility gave the conversation new material. Someone said she had built it crooked, which was not true. Someone said the county would come after her for permits, which was also not true. She had pulled every permit required, had filed the paperwork herself, had passed the inspections. Someone said it was an eyesore, which was a matter of opinion, though Mara privately thought the barn was beautiful in the plain, purposeful way that things built to solve real problems tend to be beautiful. Chet Burl drove past it on his way to check his upper pasture fence one afternoon in late October, and stopped his truck at the end of her drive for a long moment, looking up at the structure. Against the sky, she was outside splitting wood, and she saw him stop there, saw him looking. She did not wave. After a moment he drove on. November came, and with it the reliable cold and the unreliable snow, the kind that fell for a day and melted and fell again and finally, around the third week of the month, decided to stay. She settled into the winter's rhythms, cutting through the airspace to the woodpile each morning, keeping the fire fed at the level required now rather than the desperate maximum she'd run the year before. She read in the evenings. She cooked. She listened to the wind against the outer walls and felt, for the first time since moving to Wyoming, something that was not merely the absence of the city's noise, but the presence of actual quiet. December was cold, and January was colder, and then February arrived and the mountains made their move. She heard about it first on the radio, a small weather station she kept on the kitchen shelf that picked up the Billings forecast. The National Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning for the entire region, the kind of language that the Weather Service does not use casually. Winter storm, life, threatening conditions, wind gusts to 70 miles per hour, snowfall accumulations of 3 to 4 feet possible in the mountain areas. Travel not recommended, travel not advised, travel, the language finally settling into its most direct form, could be fatal. The storm was 24 hours out when the warning came. She spent that day in a way she had never spent a storm preparation day before, calmly, methodically, without urgency, because there was no urgency. The firewood was already stacked and dry in the protected airspace. The root cellar held enough food for 6 weeks. The water system was protected. The outer structure would take whatever the storm brought. She was sure of this the way she was sure of the engineering and the load calculations and the 3 separate reviews she had done and the stamp Sandra Cho had put on the drawings. She brought in an extra day's worth of wood and stacked it inside the cabin itself, within arm's reach of the fireplace. She filled every pot and container she owned with water against the possibility that the line would freeze despite everything. She charged her radio and her flashlights and her emergency phone. She made a pot of soup and a pot of beans and put them in the cold airspace where they would keep. Then she went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept until the sound of the wind woke her at 2 in the morning. The storm had arrived. She lay in bed and listened. The wind was unlike anything she had heard before, not a howl but a pressure, a sustained and total pressure against the outer walls that made the whole structure sing in its joints, the deep tonal vibration of heavy timber under load, a sound that was not distress but effort. She thought about the calculations. She thought about the load path from the gambrel trusses down through the posts to the piers, the way the lateral bracing distributed the wind force across the whole frame rather than concentrating it at any single point. She thought about Sandra Cho looking at the drawings and saying conservative and well considered. She got up and made coffee and sat by the fire and listened to the storm. Outside, the snow was coming in horizontal sheets driven by wind that peaked above 60 miles an hour in the gusts. She could not see the ridge through the windows. There was nothing to see but white, total and absolute. The thermometer outside the inner cabin wall, mounted in the airspace, read 12 degrees. The thermometer inside the cabin read 64. The fire was running at normal pace, not emergency pace, consuming wood at the rate she had budgeted for a normal cold night. She thought about the year before, on a lesser storm than this one, sleeping in 3 layers with ice on the inside of the windows, and the fire burning at maximum, and the cold coming through the logs anyway because the logs were alone against everything the mountains sent. She read for a while. She ate breakfast. She kept the fire fed. The storm ran for 31 hours. When it ended, the world outside the barn was a different world. The snow was 4 feet deep on the level, and drifted to 7 and 8 feet in the places where the terrain and the wind had conspired to pile it. The access road was buried completely, not drifted over but buried, the road itself indistinguishable from the fields on either side of it. The lower pasture was a single flat white plain. The fence posts along the ridge had disappeared to their tops. She opened the barn's main door, a big sliding door on the south side, which had been sheltered enough that the snow came only to knee-height against it, and stood looking out at the changed world. The cold air came in clean and absolute, and she breathed it and felt the warmth of the space at her back, the warmth that the structure had held through 31 hours of assault, and she thought about something her father had said once about the difference between stubbornness and patience. Stubbornness was pushing against a thing until either you or the thing gave way. Patience was building something that could stand while the thing exhausted itself. She took stock. The barn had shed the snow load without issue. The gambrel pitch was steep enough that the accumulation had slid off in sheets during the storm and piled against the north and east sides to a depth she would have to shovel out before the next storm. The outer walls showed no distress, no racking, no cracked boards. The foundation piers, visible where the wind had scoured the snow away at the base of the structure, were solid. The roof line was clean and true. Inside the cabin, the overnight low had been 57 degrees, with the fire banked to coals, not burning actively, at 4 in the morning when she had checked it half-asleep. 57 degrees. The year before, on a lesser night, the fire at full burn had barely held 50. She spent the first day after the storm digging out. The work was hard and good, the kind of work that asks everything from your body and gives you a particular kind of clarity in exchange. She cleared the sliding door completely, then worked her way around the barn's perimeter, shoveling away the accumulated drifts so the foundation could drain when the melt came. She cleared the woodpile access. She cleared the path between the cabin's back door and the barn interior. By afternoon, she could see all the way down to the county road, and she stopped shoveling and looked. 3 of the valley's properties, all visible from her ridge, had suffered storm damage. The Peterson place, half a mile down the road, had lost a section of outbuilding roof. The old tin roof she could see even from this distance had buckled under the load, the rafters underneath apparently not equal to what the storm had piled on them. The vacation rental on the east side of the road, which had been built cheap in the early 2000s by someone who had apparently not consulted a local about what local winters looked like, had a collapsed porch. And the old Prairie barn at the base of the ridge, which had been standing since the 1950s, and which several people in town had mentioned as a landmark, had lost its entire north wall, the old boards and battens exploded outward by the force of the drift pressing against them from outside. In Cutter's Bend itself, the power had been out for 19 hours. 3 families had sheltered at the community center. The county road crew had worked through the storm and the day after it to clear the main road, which they had done, but the side roads and private drives would wait for days or weeks depending on equipment availability and priority. She heard all this on the 3rd day after the storm, when she drove into town in the truck with its chains on, the road still rough and uneven but passable. The diner was full in the particular way it gets full after an emergency. People who had been isolated seeking the company of people who understood what it had been like because they had been through the same thing. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee, and the woman behind the counter, a longtime local named Ruby, who had worked the diner for as long as anyone in Cutter's Bend could remember, poured her cup and leaned on the counter and said, "How'd you do up on the ridge?" "Fine," Mara said. The structure held. "I heard," Ruby said. She said it in a way that indicated she had heard more than just that. Chet Burrell was in yesterday. He said he drove past on his snowmobile the day after the storm looking to see if you needed help, and he said your barn looked like it hadn't even noticed. Mara drank her coffee. He seemed bothered by that. Ruby added, without emphasis, "I imagine it was a hard storm for his operation," Mara said. She had seen from her ridge that one of Burrell's outbuildings had lost part of a roof as well. Not the Peterson property she had identified from the distance, but another one, closer to his main operation. "I hope his losses were limited." Ruby looked at her for a moment with the look of someone deciding something. He also said, "And I'm just telling you what was said in this room. You understand, he said that what you built up there was either the luckiest accident or the smartest thing done on that ridge in 20 years. Mara set her cup down. "It wasn't an accident," she said. "No." Ruby said, "I didn't think so." In the days that followed, the conversation in Cutter's Bend shifted in the way that conversations in small towns do after events prove someone right who had been doubted. It did not reverse completely. That would have required more generosity than most groups are capable of, but the laughter stopped and something more thoughtful replaced it, something in the range of reassessment. Dale Hennessy at the hardware store asked her if she would be willing to explain the principle of the thermal buffer to him, that he had a customer asking about winter insulation problems, and he thought the concept might be relevant. She talked to him for an hour, and he asked good questions, and she could see the professional interest behind them, the pleasure of a man who liked knowing how things worked encountering something he hadn't encountered before. Chet Burrell did not come to apologize, which she did not expect. What he did do in the early spring was drive up her road in his truck and stop at the end of the drive, and this time, when she was outside working on the root cellar expansion, she did look up and he did lift his hand from the steering wheel in the gesture that passes in that country for acknowledgement between people who have not resolved anything but have arrived at a kind of truce. She returned it in the same way. He drove on. She did not feel vindicated in the way that she had imagined feeling vindicated in those early months when the laughter had followed her around the diner. Vindication was a dish that looked better at a distance than it tasted up close. What she felt was something simpler and more durable, which was the particular satisfaction of a person who had spent a winter warm and dry because she had thought carefully and built well, and who had spent the worst storm in memory inside a structure that had done exactly what she had designed it to do. The next fall she added the chickens she had been planning, 12 hens and a rooster, housed in a converted corner of the barn's interior where the temperature never dropped below 20 even on the coldest nights, because the outer structure protected it, and the birds themselves generated surprising amounts of heat. The eggs were a luxury she had not expected to care about as much as she did. She added a cold frame along the south face of the barn that captured the winter sun, and let her grow greens through February when nothing in the valley gardens was growing. She added a rainwater collection system that fed into the root cellar cistern. She made the place progressively more what it had always been on its way to being, a piece of land and a set of structures and a way of living that fit each other with the precision of things that had been thought about long and built carefully. The cabin at the center of it all remained what it had always been, small, solid, original, its logs holding the century of cold and heat and weather in their fibers. It was warmer now than it had ever been, but it was still itself. The barn around it was still a barn, functional and plain and built to last. Between them was the airspace she had created on purpose, the dead air that was not dead at all but alive with the physics of temperature and mass and time, doing quietly and continuously the work it had been designed to do. She thought sometimes about the woman who had built this place in the 1940s, some homesteader or rancher's wife whose name had not survived in any record she could find, who had chosen this ridge and this view and had put up 4 walls and a roof against everything the mountains could send. That woman had known something about what it meant to face a winter alone, and she had built what she could build with what she had, and the logs she had put up were still standing. Mara thought she would have understood. She thought they might have liked each other. The second winter in the nested structure, she kept a log of temperatures, interior and exterior and the airspace, recorded twice daily. She sent a copy to Sandra Cho in Billings with a note. Sandra wrote back and said the data was interesting and asked if she would mind if she cited it in a presentation she was giving to an architecture conference in the spring. Mara said she didn't mind at all. Spring came the way it always comes in the mountains, late and sudden and entirely on its own terms, the snow still deep on the north, facing slopes in April, while the south, facing meadows, had been mud and early green for a month. The elk came through the lower pasture again, and the coyotes answered each other across the ridge, and the aspens put out their leaves in the pale, tentative way they have, as though they are not entirely certain the decision is final. She sat on the bench she had built outside the barn's south door in the evening and looked at the valley below and thought about the next thing, the next problem, the next piece of the place that she had not yet solved. There was always a next thing. That was what she had come to understand about this kind of life. Not that it was simple or that it rewarded sentimentality, but that it was perpetually, genuinely interesting to a person who was paying attention, and that the questions it posed were real questions to which the answers actually mattered. The valley held the last of the evening light in its bowl, the shadows of the mountains moving slowly across the fields below her. Somewhere down there, she knew, people were sitting in the broken axle and talking about their neighbors and their animals and their land and their plans, and some of those conversations included her and some did not, and she had made her peace with all of it. She had built what she had set out to build. It had done what she had designed it to do. The winter had come, and the worst of it had come, and the structure had stood. That was enough. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She went inside and fed the chickens and checked the fire and made her dinner and read until she was tired, and then she went to bed, and the wind came off the mountains and pressed itself against the outer walls, and the outer walls held it, and inside the cabin it was warm.